These anti-aircraft forts were built in the 1940s to assist the shore batteries against the impending invasion from France by the Nazis. They have stood in the sea 9 miles off Whitstable in Kent for over 30 years. But between the years of 1964 to 1967, they became household names to millions of people, not as forts on the shivering sandbank, but as a pirate radio station. This is the story of
your Tower of Power. Radio City time, 12 and a half before 4 o'clock. Mike Side, Ian McRae. With the hits of today. In Monsters Macca's music show.
Radio City, it's on time until 9.
The story of Radio City is a remarkable one. It's a story of adventure, excitement, and finally tragedy. It is also the story of one man, Reginald Calvert. Calvert was a manager of many up-and-coming pop groups and pop singers. The only way to bring his artists to the public eye was either through conventional means or a publicity stunt. On March 27, 1964, Calvert heard something on his radio that started him to formulate his next stunt.
You're tuned to Radio Caroline on 199, your all-day music station.
Radio Caroline was a boat converted into a radio station moored in international waters off Harwich. Pirate radio was born, and unknown to Calvert, so was Radio City. Very quickly, Radio Caroline became hot news. Calvert wanted to cash in on this, so he devised a stunt which would make David, Screaming Lord, such a name that everyone would know. Calvert hired a fishing boat from Southend called the Cornucopia to sail up the Thames, proclaiming Radio Such was here. Screaming Lord Such has a different view of those early days.
Publicity stunt? No. The whole thing about Radio Such was that to give the young people of the country a chance to listen to commercial radio and give a chance to unknown musicians to send in tapes, unknown rock and roll singers to get heard, because the BBC had the monopoly and were just playing the sort of track that they liked. Plus we had a bloody good time doing it.
The stunt worked. Calvert and Such and the bogus radio station soon hit the papers. He'd hoaxed the public, but most of all the newspaper world. To Calvert, the whole affair was over. Unforeseen by him and Such, the public interest had been aroused, and people were tuning in their radios to hear the station on 197 meters in the medium wave band. Realizing the interest he had stirred up, Calvert was morally forced to start a real radio station. So he quickly set out to find a boat he could convert for the purpose, but to no avail. Then Brian Paul, who was in on the hoax, had a telephone call.
Rich Calvert saying, can you get down to Leigh-on-Sea tomorrow morning, bring David Such, and bring an overnight bag as well. So, what for, Reg? And he said, well, just get there and we'll talk about it when you arrive. So we arrived about 11 o'clock in the morning at Leigh-on-Sea, parked the car, took the bag and met Reg, and he said, we're going on this boat. Fine, you know, it's a nice day for a trip. Where are we going? Well, we're going out to some towers called Shivering Sands. Okay, so we got on the boat, and while we were going, he then told us that we were going to start up a radio station on these towers, and that I was going to be a disc jockey. Well, we saw the towers in the distance and they looked quite foreboding. And it took a long time to arrive, and they got bigger and bigger and bigger until we drew up to the landing stage at the bottom and looked up, and they were enormous from where we looked. And the job we had to then was to climb up. Well, the first stage was fairly easy. It was just an ordinary iron ladder going up the side of the towers. I suppose it went up about 40 feet. And then at the top of this ladder was a ledge. It was supposed to be a ledge anyway, which stretched across to another ladder which went up to a trapdoor. The only problem was the ledge had disintegrated, and all there was an iron girder. And the job then was to walk across the iron girder, and that wasn't very funny. Anyway, we managed to get up onto the next ladder and open the trapdoor, and that was the first view we had of what was going to be home for the next few months.
The towers were ideal. Calvert bought some equipment and lowered a banner from the forts, proudly displaying the station's name. and Radio Such joined the now slowly mounting pirate radio stations off the English coast. This time, it was no farce. So, on May 27th, 1964, on 197 meters, Radio Such started its life.
You're tuned to Radio Such.
And then we went on the air. But of course, the batteries only lasted for a short space of time, about 2 hours, and we needed to recharge them for an equal period, so we were on and off the air for 2 hours at a time. The problem then, of course, was to get the generator working. It was an old one, as everything about the towers was. Everything we started with was all second-hand, probably a lot older than that. And in order to get the generator working, we had to have somebody servicing it constantly. So sometimes we weren't regular on the shows when we were supposed to be coming on.
Due to lack of records, the DJs had to talk more. The subjects were very often bizarre and usually bore no relation to broadcasting. This made such an acute change from the professional format of Radio Caroline that very shortly Radio Such formed an image of a very friendly, personal station. Screaming Lord Such then suddenly sold his shares in the station to his manager Calvert in September. Calvert changed the name and broadcasting frequency from 197 to 299 meters. He installed a new 1 kilowatt transmitter that took the station from the confines of a local broadcasting radius to the London area. Calvert had now a pirate radio station that could rival Radio Caroline and another new station, Radio London. So Radio City was born.
299. Your tower of power. On the move and in the groove amongst us Macca's late-night music show.
1965 dawned. Calvert had by now thrown himself into his radio station. He applied his station to promote his artists and used some of them to make jingles and the station call signs. He realized what a market there was for commercial radio, and he, Calvert, was going to tap it. Calvert's niece came out onto the forts, and soon his wife, Dorothy Calvert, became interested and involved in the running of the station. Tony Pine, an engineer in the early part of City's history, tells of the beginning.
It was a feat, a great feat, both on the part of the chaps taking part and the technical achievements that they, in fact, produced under terrible conditions and technically impossible conditions.
The same year, offices and a fan club were opened, first in Whitstable and then in Denmark Street, known worldwide as Tin Pan Alley. Calvert now started to employ staff, but continued his idea of the unknown personality. Therefore, all of the DJs who were employed in 1965 to 1967 were completely unknown, such as Phil Jay, now working on the London Broadcasting Company.
Reg Calvert used a lot of unknown DJs. In fact, I think they were almost all unknown DJs because he felt, and I'm sure he was absolutely right, that if a person could do the job adequately, then why not give them the chance? And whether it's Radio City or any other station, why not? And also, of course, I suppose it probably tended to save money as well. So Radio City, I thought, would probably be a very good thing. And in fact, it turned out to be, because I got on to Reg Calvert and said, well, look, I've been working for FBS, and now I'd like to try and do something for you. And he said, well, let's have a tape and see what happens. So what we did to try and make something a little bit different, we decided to not do a studio program, but to make it an outside broadcast a couple of times a week, or once a week originally. So we went to a discotheque, which I was very involved in at the time, and recorded a program there. We had people on the show talking, we played records, talked to the kids, and Reg Calvert liked it, and it became a regular program called Discomania, which started off as being once a week, and after a very short time it was not once a week, nor even once a day, but twice a day, 7 days a week. So that was 14 programs a week I had to push out, which was actually quite hard going.
City programs started to have a great following. DJ Adrian Love, also now working on LBC, remembers a more adventurous one called the Auntie Mabel Hour, which gathered a gigantic following.
The Auntie Mabel Hour was a creation of an incredible young man who's now on a station called 2SM in Sydney called Ian McRae. And I was a little bit of a latecomer to Auntie Mabel's world. McRae, Alan Clark, who is now in Hilversum in Holland, and the late and sadly lamented Paul Kramer were the three instigators of the Auntie Mabel hour. And I got rowed in, and they found that I was capable of doing unlikely voices and had the same kind of sideways attitude to the world that the rest of the team had. And on occasions found myself ad-libbing an hour comedy show with McRae rushing around, researching ideas. We prefer the phrase researching to plagiarism. And generally trying anything and everything that we could do. It was for a pirate station, an offshore station, it was a departure. Because it was almost goon humour with the odd gramophone record thrown in. We got complaints. We wouldn't have been doing the job right if we hadn't got complaints.
Life aboard the station was not as glamorous as the listeners were led to believe. Dick Dixon remembers.
We went out on the boat and went out to these towers. I don't think I'd ever imagined anything like that. It was rusty towers standing out in the middle of the Thames estuary. And that was the radio station. And I went up on board, and I found that there were three chaps there. They were living in sort of camping conditions. They were living on camp beds and eating out of tins, and not exactly my idea of what a radio station should be. But I suppose I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And I went out with the owner and came back, and he said, well, you've got the job. So next week I went out there, and I stayed out there then for 2 weeks. And I suppose in that 2 weeks the radio station was sold to me. The life on board really was an adventure every time.
All through 1965, Radio City grew from obscurity to a station of many millions of listeners. Then a threat came of a larger radio station from the USA with huge financial backing coming to England. Radio Caroline started to worry and approached Calvert with a view to a merger. Mrs. Calvert tells of that time in City's life.
In 1965, there was a rumour that there was going to be another commercial station named Radio London, but it was going to come equipped with a 50 kilowatt transmitter and all the power that was needed to cover the whole of England. Of course, this was a terrific worry to the people already engaged in broadcasting off the shores of England, and Radio Caroline approached my husband with the idea of an amalgamation. This was to make Radio City a booster station for the Caroline network. When I say booster, I mean that the signals would be transmitted from the ship, and then with the aid of a larger transmitter and a better aerial, the signal would be boosted to a much higher power with a much greater coverage of England from Radio City. So the terms were agreed, and the advertising revenues were pooled. Radio Caroline started looking for a transmitter, and in the end informed my husband that they'd traced one and it was going to be delivered. But as it happened, the Radio Caroline technicians went out, saw this monstrosity and said, nothing doing, you'll never make a transmitter out of this, it's completely out of date. So what with that, and then odd broadcasts from the government about closing down these pirate stations, Radio Caroline backed out.
Although this transmitter was never used, it was to become a dramatic excuse in the later history of the towers. Undeterred, the station continued to run on a family basis.
I got involved in the station right at the beginning in a small way, but it was Good Friday 1966 when I eventually took over the management of the DJs. And I went out to the towers. It was a very nice day. They just had the new large aerial erected, and I went on board on this terrific platform. I was literally thrown onto the platform and hoisted up the towers, screaming all the way, and I went into the studio and sat with Ian McRae while he was doing his broadcast, noticed everything that was going on, asked questions, came off in the end and back to shore, and started thinking about the possible ways of running commercial radio in a more business-like fashion. And I came up with format radio.